Hello everyone! Today I'm going to be making this white Dreamcatcher, so if you're interested in learning how, then keep on watching! So the items that you're going to need for this are going to be some white buckskin and a metal ring. I already covered this metal ring with the buckskin, but I do show how I do it in another video of mine. You'll need a lighter, some scissors, some white sinew, a couple different styles of white buffalo bone beads, some white feathers, and some type of centerpiece. So once you have your ring covered with the buckskin, you're going to start unraveling some of your sinew. And you're going to want more sinew than you think you're going to need just because you don't want to run out. And you always want to have more and have extra at the end than run out and need to make repairs, which it can be very difficult and also really annoying if it doesn't work and you have to rip the whole thing up. So where you want to secure the knot is right over where you last glued down the buckskin onto the ring. This just holds it in place a little bit better and also just gives it a neater look. Next, I start laying out my hair pipe beads. I want to just get an idea of where I'm going to place them, also make sure that I have enough, and also gives me a good visual on where I'm going to place the knots once I start threading them on and making the weave. You don't want to not allow yourself enough space when you start putting them on and then you end up when you get around the circle where it doesn't fit properly. So laying them out before you start working is always a good idea. So now you just start threading the hair pipes on, and when you are doing these, I always suggest that using authentic materials such as buffalo bone beads, especially in hair pipes. It always looks better when you have real bone. You can do plastic, and of course that is a much cheaper option than bone, but when you want something to last for a long time, I have found that the bone beads definitely, I guess you can say, hold their color and age well. When the plastic ones are in the sunlight for too long, sometimes they can turn yellow and they can also crack, and they just don't look as nice. It just makes the Dreamcatcher kind of look cheap when you do use plastic. Another tip that I have for making sure that your spacing is accurate as you're going around, especially on this first pass of beads around the ring, is to use one of these mats that I have in the background. This is a self-healing rotary mat for the rotary cutter that I have, but I like that it shows the measurements in the background, and sometimes it's just good to have a little bit of a visual to see where you need to actually space the beads. It can get confusing as you're going, and if you're even off sometimes just by a centimeter, by the time you get to the last bead, sometimes you can have either too much space or too little space, and then you have to start, backtracking and starting, kind of all over again, getting the spacing correct. You can also use your fingers as a guide. The spacing that I have here is about 3 fingers wide. Also a tape measure, or even just a piece of paper where you draw a couple of lines on it, just as an easy guide as you go around. So now that I've gotten all the way around the ring, I'm going to use that first little piece that I had from my knot at the beginning. I'm going to tie it onto the string that I have now, and I'm just going to make sure that it is tied as tight as I can get it so it's secured and is not going to move. And sometimes the sinew can be a little bit slippery, so I found that just using one of these jewelry pliers, you can just kind of twist the sinew and you can get a little bit of a better grip to make it as tight as you can. And then of course the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take your lighter and you're just going to melt down that little piece of sinew so you can squash it into the ring so it lays flat. I always like to give the little melted piece of sinew a little bit of time to cool completely before I start, pulling on the string again and weaving around. I just feel like, sometimes if it's still a little bit warm, it does come unraveled. So the next thing I do once it's cool is I just decided that instead of packing on the beads like I do on some of my more traditional dream catchers, I was going to make them a little bit more spaced out. So I just went around and I did your typical weave without any extra beads. This also gives a nice little design look when you pull on that string and the hair pipes start to slant inwards. So now that I've made it around the ring one more time with the weave, I'm going to start laying out my next set of beads, just again to see the design pattern that I want. Also to see how many beads I'm going to need and also get that visual on spacing. The beads that I'm using here are also a white buffalo bone and I think that they are a 12mm size. Now that I have everything laid out and I can see exactly what I want to do, I'm going to start threading them on the sinew and weaving them around. And the reason that I am choosing to do 2 beads instead of 1 is just because it's about half the size of the first bead. So since I used a longer one to start with, I don't want to suddenly go too small of a bead next. It just gives it a little bit more balance and it also lays nicely once you start getting that weave around. I also just want to mention that you always want to weave your Dreamcatcher in a clockwise direction. You never want to go counterclockwise unless there's no other option. I know that some people who are left-handed have a hard time going clockwise, so they do go counterclockwise, but just for mystical reasons, it's always best to go clockwise if possible. So now that I have all of the round beads on, I'm just going to start eyeballing that centerpiece and how much space I have left to work with. I know that I want to go at least one more time around to have that balance of the weave, but I like to make sure that I'm leaving myself enough space so when I do hang that centerpiece, that there's enough room for it to kind of sit in there a little bit freely. So I made it one time around, and I probably could have put the centerpiece in there right away, but I decided that I wanted to go just one more time around with the weave just to give a little bit more dimension to the Dreamcatcher. So I'm just kind of eyeballing again, making sure that I'm going to have enough space for when I do hang it, and that it's not going to be pushed out of the center. So now that I've made it the second time around, again I'm measuring to make sure that centerpiece fits, and it fits in there perfectly. So I'm going to start tying off the Dreamcatcher, and you just want to, snip enough string so you have enough to work with that's going to be comfortable, and then you're going to split it. Usually if you have a good quality sinew, you can split it 4 or 5, even up to like 6 times or more, and this way you just want to split it in half, and I'll show you where you want to start tying it. So where you have your knot, you want to go to the next knot over. You're going to put one piece into that little triangle and then one into the triangle behind it. Then you'll flip it over and you will tie it in a really secure knot. You can tie it really tight because it will pull the 2 knots together that are on the weave, and it will make it look nice and neat. So again, if you want to make sure that it's nice and tight, you can use those little pliers, pull it really tight with that good grip, and then you'll just snip it. You want to leave about 1/4 inch to melt down. Any less and it might not be enough. So you just melt that down, and then you tap the little melted spot with the hot part of the metal lighter, and I usually just pinch it and make sure that it's good to go. So now it's time to get that centerpiece tied on. What I'm using here is an abalone. It's actually a front side and a back side. The front side is a green-blue abalone and the back side is more of a mother-of-pearl abalone. And it's just 2 pieces and they are glued together. And there's a hole drilled on the top and a hole drilled on the bottom. I was having a little bit of a hard time getting the sinew through there because the inside of it was hollow, so every time I was pushing it through, the sinew was bending. But I finally did get it through there, and instead of tying just a little knot, I was afraid that it might get pulled through the abalone. I decided to grab a small little spacer bone bead and tie it to the bottom part of the abalone so the string would not pull through. So again, I just tied it on there just like I do any other bead, where I tie it on and then cut a little piece and then use the lighter to melt it down. I just wanted to make sure that it was going to be secure. Now that I got this shell tied onto the string, I found the spot on the Dreamcatcher where I wanted to hang it. Sometimes it's going to be right at the spot that you began in, and sometimes it's going to be just a little bit to the left or to the right. It depends on actually where you end the Dreamcatcher, where you end the weave, that's going to show the most balance. So again, you're just going to split the sinew. That's why it's so nice to work with this instead of any other type of string, is because you can make knots and you can melt it down, and it just looks so clean when you're done. So anyway, you're going to find that spot, and you're going to, on either side of a knot, you are going to put one string into one of the triangles and then the other little string into the other triangle. And you're just going to tie a knot on the back, and again you will tie it down, cut it short, and then use your lighter to melt that knot together. Now that I had the main part of the Dreamcatcher done, now it was going to be assembling the feathers on a type of pattern that I wanted to do. So these are smaller white fluffy feathers, and I decided that I was going to do probably 5 different strings of them. Some shorter ones on the outside, and then you want the longer ones on the middle on the bottom. So by longer, I mean you'll use like 5 feathers, and then on the shorter outside, you'll use about 3 or 4. This just gives a nice little angled shape to the Dreamcatcher when it is hanging. So now I'm going to start tying the feathers onto the sinew, and what I've done here is I've taken the leftover piece of sinew that I had from weaving the Dreamcatcher, and I have split it 5 times. So I have 5 pieces all the same length, and I'm just going to tie the feathers onto it. I'm just wrapping the sinew around the feather a few times and then tying it into a knot. And then I will do the same thing with this like I did with every other knot that I have done, where I trim the end and then melt it down. So now that I have the sinew tied on to one of the feathers, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the beads. Right here I'm just trying to measure to see if I can fit the bead onto the feather with the sinew, and I just needed to trim back a little bit part of that little stem on the feather there. I'm not sure what that is called, the quill, I think. I just had to trim it back a little bit so I could fit the bead onto it. Now the reason why I add the beads to the feathers is because it gives a little bit of weight to it. If I didn't add the beads and I just had the feathers on the string, they are so weightless that they would just get tangled up and kind of fly around aimlessly. At least when I have the beads on there, it gives a nice weight. It'll hold the strings kind of down, so the Dreamcatcher keeps a nice shape while it's hanging. So as I was doing this, I decided to warm up my hot glue gun just so I could put just a little bit of dab of glue onto where that bead is going to go. This is just going to prevent it from shifting, and also these feathers are really fluffy, and I just wanted to kind of paste down a little bit of that fluff so it would just slide into that bead nicely without having, a bunch of little fluffy feathers sticking out. So sometimes you need to use the glue gun. I don't always like to use glue on my Dreamcatchers unless it's like a situation like this. The way that I'm spacing the feathers out on the string is I'm allowing just a tiny bit of overlap, maybe about a ½ an inch onto the next feather. So I'm just trying to figure out where I'm going to tie it onto the feather on a nice spot where it's the most fluffy. So what I'm doing here is I'm just pulling a little bit off of that quill, trimming it down, and then I'm going to tie it on, slip the bead over it, again using a little bit of glue, and just affix them all to the string. As I was trying to tie a knot onto this feather, the fluff was just so intense. I just had to, just pull the whole thing off and start over again. The last thing I wanted was it to be just like one big messy feather right there. So sometimes you just gotta start over. So I am just continuing to add feathers and a bead on the string, and I'll show you how I do one full string of feathers here. The reason why I like to do it all on one string like this is because when it hangs, you don't see a lot of bare string. I mean, you can obviously just put one string and then a feather at the end, but then you are having a lot of string just showing there with nothing on it, and I just think it gives, just a nicer look when it's not a bare string, but the string is completely covered by the feather. So I went ahead and did the remaining 4 strings of feathers off camera, otherwise we would have been here for like 2 hours. So I got the rest of them done, and now I'm just kind of organizing them and setting them up how I want them to look once I tie them onto the Dreamcatcher. And like I said before, it's always nice to have the longest ones down at the bottom and then have kind of the shorter ones up towards the top. That just gives the nice round and elongated, symmetrical looking Dreamcatcher. So when you start tying on the feathers, you always want to start with the middle one. You never want to start with the side. You always want to work from the middle one and then go both ways out. That way you know that you're going to have the longest one completely centered with your centerpiece. Now, because I have split this sinew already 5 times, I can't split it again. Otherwise it would just be too thin. So what I'm doing is I'm just basically tying a regular knot onto the ring using the 1 string. Now you also want to leave just a little bit of a gap between the ring and that bead that's on the feather, just so when you do hang up the Dreamcatcher, if you put it in the corner and it's not flat up against a wall, it does have the ability to have movement. If you tie it on real too tight and it's just flush right up against that ring, it can sometimes make it a little bit stiff when it's hanging. The way that I'm spacing where I'm tying the feathers on is because I was very careful on the spacing and had everything even when I did the first weave of the hair pipe beads. I can use it kind of as a guide to where to place the feathers. It also gives it a nice symmetrical look when you have them the feathers spaced the same amount as you had the weave. You'll see as soon as I hang it up here what I mean. But that's why it's important to make sure that you're measuring correctly when you really first start out. So now that I have all of the feathers on, I'm going to make the hanger. So you're just going to unravel a little bit of the sinew and you're going to tie it in a knot so it creates a little loop. So now you just tie the hanger on and you just want to make sure that it's completely centered and also that that little melted knot is going to be placed in the back of the Dreamcatcher so you can't see it when it is hanging. And now my Dreamcatcher is done. I will insert a few of the photos of the final product and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.